Good morning. Today is July 7th, 2020. We're covering the spleen. The spleen's a really interesting, interesting zong. So in the Neijing, it's interesting that the spleen and stomach are given the same charge, right? Right there for the rotting and ripening, transforming and transporting of the nutrition of what we eat, drink, and the five tastes are what stem from them. So it's really interesting that, you know, unlike any other pair of Zong and Fu, they're given they're sort of seen as like one thing in the Neijing. So it tells you a lot about how it's really hard to treat one without treating the other. Now, there are certainly lots of patterns that differentiate between the stomach and spleen, but in my experience, in my clinical experience, it's really hard to treat one without treating the other. And it's a little bit easier to treat the stomach without the spleen, but it's really challenging to bring healing to the spleen without also treating the stomach, because they work so integrally together in terms of the process of digestion. So the spleen is said to govern the postnatal qi. Excuse me. Actually, I just wanted to repeat the charge again, because I gave you sort of like the paraphrase version. But the charge is the spleen and the stomach are responsible for the storehouses and granaries, and the five tastes stem from them. So it's a little bit difficult sometimes thinking about how this translates into modern practice. And really the way it does is looking at the basic trajectory of the channels, right? So if you look at the primary channel and the deep pathways and where the deep pathway goes, that gives you a lot of insight into what an official does. Because similarly, like if you're in charge, if you have a certain domain of authority, you know, chances are you're not going to have much authority where you don't go, right? If you're in charge of, like, say, you know, like you've got a couple of offices, you know, you're not going to be in charge of some office like down the road where you never go, right? You have your territory. And similarly, the the meridians are sort of like, you know, they define the territory of authority. Okay. And these were considered, you know, the way they looked at them as officials in the governance of a kingdom, of a country. Okay. So the spleen is said to govern the postnatal qi. So there's prenatal qi and postnatal qi. As you probably already know, postnatal qi is the qi you get after you're born, right? It's not what you get from your mother in your mother's womb. This is what you get from what you eat, drink, and breathe. And what I would assert is also from your experiences. And as we'll talk about this in terms of the points later, we kind of eat our life, right? Our experiences help make us who we are. They either nourish us, or they make us sick, or they're neutral. So the key when dealing with the earth is a conversation in a word that doesn't really show up or figure prominently in the literature, but I would say is integration. So anytime you think about digestion, I want you to think about integration on the mental, emotional, and spirit level, right? Because as you eat your life, you know, is it nourishing? Is it like, think about your experiences very much, and I would say almost exactly like food. And remember, the stomach channel, right, the process of digestion, right, starts with stomach 1. Actually, it starts technically with large intestine 20, right? We talked about this in terms of the large intestine. You know, you smell something, like maybe, you know, you wake up and you're lucky enough to have somebody that like cooks for you, or you walk into a restaurant and you can smell, right? Like I don't eat in a restaurant that doesn't smell good to me. Like if I walk in and like I get a hit immediately, and if it doesn't smell like really right to me, I'm out. So it starts with large intestine 20, and then it continues more deeply with stomach 1. You see something, right? So we smell and see life, right? and it actually goes up to stomach 8, and there's some other points like close to the ear. So, you know, like the things that we see, smell, hear, right? Then it goes down by the jaw, right? And affects our taste, right? So, you know, all of this involves our senses. So similarly, when you have a visceral experience on a mind level and a spirit level, right? This is going to be either nourishing or not nourishing. And so that's why I would say really be mindful of the media that you expose yourself to. You know, a lot of the news, different programs, which might be like a guilty pleasure, but, you know, are they like, how do you feel after you like watch, I don't know, The Bachelor, or like Real Housewives of wherever, right? Or whatever it is that you watch, you know, like what does that leave you feeling? Like when you finish watching that, how do you feel? Because I remember my wife and I used to binge watch 24, this show that was like from the, I don't know, like a long time ago. It was like the early thousands with Kiefer Sutherland. And we would make the mistake of like watching these. This is when back when there was a Blockbuster video outlet, right? And we get like, you know, like 4 DVDs, and each DVD had like 3 or 4 episodes, and we would like binge watch until like 1 in the morning on a weekend. And you know, and it's so tense. This guy is like, it's like, you know, he's a secret agent fighting off, you know, like uh existential threats to our existence, like nuclear weapons and terrorists and things like that. And it's like it's tense. And so, you know, that wasn't really the best thing to watch, like at 1 in the morning when you're about to go to sleep. Consequently, your dreams are just like crazy. So I would really look at the music you listen to, the the visual media that you perceive, that you take in, and how does it leave you feeling, like honestly. Because like there's a lot of things I love to eat, but afterwards they don't really leave me feeling so great. So I have to be mindful of that. And similarly, I don't think we're very mindful about what we ingest through our eyes and our ears, you know, through the internet, on our phones and different media, right? um, because we are what we eat. And eventually, like what you take in on a subtle level or not so subtle level affects your mind. It really does. Some of you more than others, because some of you are going to have very open mental centers and very open crown centers, and maybe even very open throat centers. You know, knowing you all that I do, I know that there's like a couple of you that are like immensely open, and there's a couple of you that are a little bit more closed. And that closed is not a negative thing. Closed is not negative. Closed is not bad. Open is not good. It's just we have a certain energetic nature that's going to allow us to do our work in the world, right? So if you have a closed, not closed as in nothing gets in, but if you're more defined and you're not less open to influence from others and external stimuli, that's going to help you be the best you in the world. If you're very open and you're very open to external stimuli, that's going to help you be the you that you need to be in the world. And the world needs you to be exactly as you are in no different way, right? So I don't know if I'm making any sense at all, but some of you are going to be like very susceptible to the influence of external stimuli, and some of you are going to be less so. And that's by design. That is your design. But you have to
Time.
be, but you have to be
Oh,
mindful of it. Yes, go ahead.
um, I, for example, I love rap music, and when I listen to it, I genuinely am like I'm like vibrating when I'm
Great.
done. Like, I have to like be like, oh no, can't listen to that now. Have to listen to something else, you know, because I definitely feel like
Right.
all hyped up, you know.
Yeah.
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 So it's 100%, and it's not necessarily a good feeling either. Like there are
Right.
times, oh, you don't do that to yourself today, you know.
Right. Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I know what you mean. I actually when I was living in New York, I actually used to work for Jive Records. And, you know, so I like rap too. I like all kinds of music actually. But I noticed that, like, you know, if you think about medicine and TV and everything that you ingest, either through your mouth or through your nose or through your eyes and ears, if you think of it as medicine, every medicine has its timing and every medicine has its dosage, right? Like last Friday, for example, I had like a really like intense week. And when I came home, like I just I went downstairs and I just like blasted the stereo and I just like jumped around to like Soundgarden, you know, like, and I actually like, you know, appreciate a very quiet, peaceful space. I spend a lot of time in meditation and prayer, but I just needed to just like rock out. And, you know, but it has a dosage, right? You know, not for an hour, you know, maybe for like 15 minutes or so, like get your yayas out and like move. And then I went for a run and it was great. So, um, think about it in terms of that, right? Because we all have our preferences, but you know, the part of us that, and this really relates to the earth, because boy, is the earth really figure heavily in our preferences. Like it really, like the earth, the stomach and spleen have a powerful effect on our mind. And they say, you know, so goes the brain, the belly, as goes the mind, and so goes the mind, as goes the belly, right? So nothing really is going to have a more large impact on your mind, a powerful impact on your mind, even your heart. Your spleen and stomach are going to actually have more of an impact on your mind than any other officials. So, you know, I mean, food and what we ingest is such a primal, pre-verbal, conditioned experience. So, you know, a lot of times we're like walking around like children in big bodies. I want this. I don't want that. I want it this way. I don't want it that way. And a lot of that is like our child self, which is not bad, but you just have to know who's like running the show. So sometimes we prefer things like, you know, sure, I'd love to start off every meal with a fudge sickle, but is that going to really be nourishing for me? Right? You know what I mean? Like, you know, I used to love like drinking very heavily, but it's just not good for me, right? I just can't do it anymore. So there's a part of us that has to connect to our heart that allows us to be present in the moment. And then, so all the influences of the officials that speak to our being, that have a voice, need to be tempered through the heart, through the heart mind, because the heart mind knows, that's its ability, that's its superpower. It's a being of knowingness, right? It knows the past, present, and future. It knows exactly what you need, when you need it, how much you need it, and the way you need it. So you have to filter things through your heart, right? Because that's going to be what guides you. And so if we're guided by our bellies, and it's no surprise to me that you know, if you kind of just look around at how people live, you know, notice what motivates them, like notice what guides them. And some of you are already in the health professions, and for those of you who are in the health professions, if you're helping people with their lifestyle and like wellness, what is the hardest thing to get anyone to do?
Change what they eat.
You got it. Change what they eat. Change what they eat. It is, as Medea said, this is the hardest, most challenging thing to do. And some of you, you know, like, and a lot of, I would say a lot of what you do, if you're really going to be like holistic, is helping people change their relationship to their stomach, spleen, and what's familiar, which may not be normal, towards something that really helps them to feel good in their bodies for a change, right? And that's a tricky dance. All right. So any questions about that before we go on? All right. So the earth really figures heavily. And why I do not treat children, I'm not a pediatric specialist. I send them all to like a buddy of mine up the Beltway. But like earth is something that you want to take into account very highly, and I would say predominantly, along with the kidney and the heart, is the earth when you're treating kids, because they are kind of like giant stomachs. All right. Right, because they're taking everything in and they're processing it really fast if like, you know, if everything's working according to nature. Okay, so the spleen governs postnatal chi. So what does that mean? It assists in digestion, in the digestive process, and actually that transforming process that happens in the stomach, that happens because of the influence of the spleen, right? It's the spleen that allows the communication between the spleen and the stomach is allowed with that churning action, the digestion action, that processing, that beginning processing that occurs on a more structural level after the saliva starts to break things down in the stomach. That's under the auspices of the stomach and the spleen. So it assists in digestion, it assists in the production of qi and blood. I have uploaded to the Canvas site the little diagram I have for the creation of qi and blood, so please look at that. It helps to tonify qi and blood. That means it helps to give it its strength from the nourishment that it receives and then transports to all corners of the kingdom, right? And as well as it, by the more yang functions of the spleen, it helps to resolve dampness, which can result in qi stagnation and edema, right? So the spleen is also helps to control the fluids and dominate the fluids. So the three main organs that are in charge of the fluids are the spleen, the lungs, and the kidneys. So they three work together to help prevent edema, to help make sure the fluids are in the right place at the right time and the right amount, and that they're flowing and doing their job. And so it's interesting that the spleen, like the yang functions of the spleen, help, to manage these fluids, which are like, in addition to the jing, these very powerful yin forces that cool, that rejuvenate, right, that nourish. And also remember, part of the blood is part fluid, right? So there's like the red stuff that comes from the heart, and then there's also the plasma, the fluids, right, that also help to the blood to circulate, right? So it's said to dominate or ensure the transformation and transportation of the nourishment, right? J.R. Worsley used to liken the spleen as a fleet of lorries. And I didn't know what a lorry was, so I had to look it up. It turns out a lorry is a truck, like a delivery truck, or like either like a tractor trailer, or like you're going down the street and you see like, like whatever, like Capital Seafood, and they're taking all the seafood like from their distribution center and they're taking it out to the stores, right? There used to be a huge center in Jessup for Giant Foods. I don't know if it's still there or not, but there'd be like literally 1,000 giant food tractor trailers, like all like that was like their major distribution hub, and they would load up all of these trucks, or like UPS from the UPS center or FedEx center, and then each of those little trucks takes them out to all the little stores around the county, the state, what have you. So that's like what the spleen does. It takes all the nourishment from the center and goes out and takes it to the periphery. Remember, Earth is about the relationship between the center and the periphery, and this is important not only physically but psychologically. And I'll just jump ahead briefly. Is, what's one of the key symptoms of spleen qi deficiency? Symptoms, not signs. What's something that people often complain about when they're spleen qi deficient, or spleen yang deficient? Anybody know? Take a stab.
If you're tired.
If you're tired, yes. And even more specifically, thank you, Farah. So even more specifically, if you feel tired in your limbs, heaviness, fatigue, your limbs feel heavy, your head, which is an extremity, feels heavy and foggy, right? So it's not making, the nourishment is not, and the qi is not making it out to the periphery, to the limbs, maybe even numbness, okay? So it's said to control the muscles in the flesh and the four limbs, providing vigor and shape or bulk, right? The spleen is in charge of like the curviness of the flesh, right? So a friend of mine, she's the one who actually got me into acupuncture. She actually convinced me to come down to acupuncture school in Maryland, which I originally did not want to do because I didn't want to leave New York. But she is a typical spleen CF, but she's a spleen deficient CF. And she just looks like skin and bone all the time, even though she's perfectly healthy. But there's not a lot of rounded, fleshy qualities to you. So for those of you who, may not like your fleshy curves, that might mean that like you've got a really good spleen. It might mean maybe you relate a lot to the earth, right? Me, I don't have a lot of spleen. I'm all angles and elbows, right? So, you know, the spleen doesn't really figure heavily in my constitution. So that's something to consider when you're like looking at somebody, like, you know, do they have vigor and shape? Do they have bulk? Or are they like skin and bone? Or do they look emaciated? Because that's a sign they're not getting the chi and the nourishment like from the center to the yes, booty. Yes. That's a couple of things, but yes, that's like liver and spleen like working together. And that you
I
just
have a question. So if somebody wakes up with pins and needles in their hands, would that be having something to do with the spleen, do you think?
well, the pins and needles is not numbness. The pins and needles
Okay.
is a sensation, and that's probably from a nerve being pinched or blocked.
Right.
So there is some quality of, you know, the transferal of the chi, you know, from the center to the periphery. So the spleen might be a little bit involved. So in that case, I'd look to see, is there dampness or damp heat in the area? But then you have to look at the particular limb in general, and what's the furthest joint, like what's the highest joint up the chain? And that might be your elbow, that might be your shoulder, it might be your neck.
Okay.
Now, what I have found often is that in vertebral fixations or subluxations or pinched nerves, if you palpate along the spine, on either side of the spine, what are called the Huato Jiaji points,
Right.
you'll feel what Matt Callison calls chi edema. It'll feel kind of spongy, like there's not a lot of chi and blood like getting circulated into that deep area, and the flesh in that area is suffering, and that would be partially a spleen issue. Okay.
So that's what you do when somebody has pins and needles, is palpate along either side of their channel.
You do.
I mean, or their spine.
Well, yeah, sure, because you know you want to see where the blockage is coming from. It might be coming from the nerve root. It might be coming further downstream. You know, maybe the shoulder, maybe the elbow, maybe the wrist. A lot of carpal tunnel is misdiagnosed because it's a shoulder problem.
Interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it also controls the blood and keeps it in place. And this is a very important function. So, you know, as we get older, you know, the chi we have that goes towards construction is reduced dramatically. And then the next in line is the chi that goes towards repair and maintenance. And then eventually that, you know, gets worn out. And then eventually, like, you know, everything is just about deterioration. That's just the way it is. And the earth does call us back, right? I mean, we come from the earth, which is symbolized by the round womb of the mother, right? It's the bowel, it's the wrapping. And, you know, the belly looks round, right? I mean, you know, baby is not a perfect sphere, but again, what happens to the belly? It gets this really nice spherical shape to it when a woman's pregnant, right? So, you know, the earth calls us back. That's why as we get older, everything starts to sag. It's because the voice of the earth is getting louder and louder, and our tissues are responding. Right? So, but it does control the blood, the blood, and it keeps the blood in its proper place. And it's actually about keeping everything in its proper place, the fluids, the blood. So as we get older, you know, the integrity of the flesh, the integrity of the vessels diminishes. And that's why you see, like in a lot of older people, you'll see these like spontaneous bruises, right? They're just, you know, they sneeze hard and all of a sudden they've got like a big red blood spot, like on their arms or hands. And again, where do you see it first? The most distal extremities, right? You don't see it first in the chest, right? Because it takes chi and energy to make it out to the extremities first, right? That's why the hands and the feet, right? And then the ankles and the knees are like the first to go, right? So you'll see a lot of these like hemorrhages or prolapses as folks get older, right? Because the spleen ascends and holds, right? And that's one aspect of chi, right? So it holds and ascends and also makes sure that the blood is kept in place. So any type of severe bleeding that's not from trauma, that's not from trauma, that's from some internal deficiency, is going to involve the spleen. So that's why it figures heavily in women who have a tendency to menstruate very heavily, right? And we'll talk a little bit that, especially in terms of spleen 1. So for those of you whose menses is extremely heavy, or it's hard to end, or slow to end or conclude, that's often the spleen is going to be involved in that. Okay, so it does control the raising of chi to counteract sinking and prolapse. So it also opens to the mouth, it manifests on the lips, and dominates your sense of taste. So it's interesting that one of the signs of COVID-19 is a sudden loss of a sense of taste. And so what this is pointing to is the relationship between the lungs and the spleen, right? That immediately it's drying out the fluids very quickly. And so the fluid dynamic has, the chi dynamic and the fluid dynamic has been severely interrupted at a deep level very quickly. And so that's, so what are the first symptoms? Like coughing, right? Which is rebellious lung chi. Fever, right? Because it's damaging the fluids. It's like this rate. The virus comes in, disrupts the chi dynamic, and then heat results in that, even though viruses by their nature are generally cold. That's why the body responds with so much heat. And then what do you get? You get frontal headache, you get difficulty, sore throat, like heat in the throat, right? And that heat it's like this virus goes in to the nasal passages, the bronchi, the lungs very quickly, very rapidly. And so it's just basically like laying waste to the fluids through this intense, exuberant heat really fast. And so it dries out all the fluids, and that's going to affect the tongue and our ability to taste. That's right. The drier your mouth is, the harder it is to taste something. And so what happens is cytokine storm, where all of a sudden the body is trying to combat this heat with what cools the body, which is fluids. But then it breaks down the lungs' capacity and the spleen's capacity to transform the fluids. So all the fluids that are rushing to the lung to cool it off are not able to be transformed, and then the fluid, all of a sudden the lungs fill with fluid because the lung and spleen's functions of transforming the fluids has become impaired. Right? Okay, so when you're reading about any kind of point on an official or organ system, you have to look at it through the lens, through the context of its functions on a body, mind, spirit level. Everything is within that context. You're looking through it through that lens, through that frame. So we'll just do a little bit more and then we'll take a short break. So the mind, in terms of the mind, just as it's about moving from the periphery to the center and from the center to the periphery, that's what Earth is about, especially spleen. This is about, on a psychological level, giving and receiving, right? That's sort of the mental, emotional version of center-periphery relationship. So this empowers our capacity for balanced, what Lonnie Jarrett calls reciprocity. That means, is there a balance between your giving and receiving? That doesn't mean they have to be exactly equal, right? You don't have to be sitting there with this like scorecard in your hand throughout the day going, well, I gave someone that, so I'm not going to give any more until I get something. You know what I mean? It just, it's not meant to be that way. It's meant to be this dynamic that when you bring it to your heart and you bring it to your body, there feels like a balance. You feel steady, right? And what does Earth do? Earth, holds things in place. That's why gravity is an earthy force, right? We don't go, the Earth at the center, at the equator is spinning at approximately 1,000 miles an hour. At our latitude, it's approximately around maybe like 850, 900 miles an hour, right? That's pretty fast. Imagine going around a curve in your car at 900 miles an hour. Like, you're going to be thrown against the door pretty hard, right? That's a lot of centripetal force. So why aren't we all flying and spinning, spiraling off the Earth? Why aren't we just go like flying off? Because we have this powerful invisible force called gravity. And so each of us, and Einstein proved that every body of mass, including us, has a gravity, right? So our force of mass is lower than the Earth, so the Earth wins, so we're stuck to the Earth. So, you know, um, we have a gravity, we attract things, but we also have to give, which allows for us to transform, right? So we don't want to hoard, right? We talked about that, the large intestine that breeds stagnation. So, you know, are you overly giving to the point where you're draining yourself and then you get resentful? And sometimes we're just forced in a situation where actually when you go to your heart, it says, yes, I really have to give and give and give and give. And maybe the timing will come later when I receive, right? Because as we know, like sometimes you have to take care of like an aging parent or an aging partner or a sick partner or a sick dog or cat or a
Or a
child.
baby.
A baby, all right. I mean, my God, right? Of course, like there's, I mean, you know, you look at new parents. I mean, they look like zombies because, you know, they're you know, not getting a lot of sleep, and all your energy is like giving, 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 giving. But there is a receiving that comes with that. It's just hard to see sometimes. So this is what you look at in terms of like the mental emotional level imbalances in Earth CFs. You know, what's their relationship to giving and receiving? Maybe they're more comfortable with one and not comfortable with the other, and that's unbalancing for them. This also allows us to, right, just as the Earth holds us to her surface, right? And it's the gravity is a loving force, right? It's about grounding, stability, right? And when we're stable, we're calm, right? So think about jet lag. You know, jet lag is like you're thrown up into the air, and according to your mind, like your mind doesn't know you're flying, you know, 600 miles an hour somewhere else. It's just like we're here and the earth has just like turned underneath of us, and now we're in Italy. And all of a sudden the sun is in a different position and I'm unstable, right? My cycle is unstable. My diurnal cycle is that chi rhythm has been disrupted, right? So it's like the earth has like moved under your feet and you're just like, what? Right? So that's a destabilizing experience for a lot of people, right? So earth and CV are really great points to treat for jet lag. All right. And then on the spirit level, that grounding, that stability is what calms the Shen, right? It's just like they, you know, like that old saying, like, it's a little bit sexist, but it's the saying, you know, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. And so, you know, I say that works for this guy at least, uh, right? So thank God my wife is an outstanding cook. Obviously, there's more important features than, I'm not saying that all women are really reduced to their ability to cook. That's not how I'm saying how you value your worth. I'm just making a human statement, which is, I think, you know, we experience a lot of joy. We experience a lot of happiness when we're eating something that tastes good and is nourishing to our body as well as our mind and our spirit. And we say that, like, sometimes we'll just like I just remember the phrase, like, you know, soul food, which is like, it may not be the best for me, but oh my God, is it so satisfying at like a deep level, right? So, right? So we all have that. Ciao, ciao. So, you know, we all have like comfort food. That was the other word I was looking for, right? I just think about, like, my grandmother used to talk about soul food a lot, right? Like, this is good for your soul. Or comfort food, right? Like, you know, I mean, who wouldn't love a really like rich, you know, buttery grilled cheese sandwich? Maybe not some of you, but you know, that's like real comfort food. Or, you know, you all have your comfort food, the things that you, or whatever it is that's like, maybe you have your comfort music or your comfort book or your comfort place in nature, right? So this is all governed by the earth. The earth's wanting to be comfortable, right? That's why, you know, wood controls earth, because sometimes change is uncomfortable, but the wood requires us to change. And in fact, that's what pain is. Pain is an invitation to change. And they say wind is the spearhead of all disease, right? So wind is like this unwanted change that kind of blusters into our home and, like, you know, blows all of our papers and stuff about and knocks some paintings, pictures off the walls and says, you know, you have to pay attention to me, right? But earth wants to sit back in its easy chair and go, yeah, this is awesome, Right? Yeah. Right? So that's why people who generally enjoy an overabundance of comfort food are generally kind of fleshy. You know, they're pretty well upholstered. Right? So that's the spleen. So it houses the yi, which is the shen of the spleen that gives us the capacity for thought and intention. It allows us to process the information that we get through our senses, through our heart sense, the sixth sense, and integrate our experiences in a way, excuse me, that nourishes us and gives us the energy to take productive action. But not just any action, to take productive action that's aligned with what's important to us, that's aligned with what the Supreme Controller says is right for us, which may be something that's considered immoral or illegal or outside the current paradigm. That's how change occurs, right? I mean, there's a part of us that witnesses something, you take it in, you chew on this experience, that doesn't taste right. That just doesn't taste good. I'm not going to eat this meal. So this is what provokes us to take effective action. And again, you know, all action just isn't under the auspices of the wood. I mean, but it has to start with the intention. Like what is it that I want to transform into something delicious, into something worth savoring, into something that's worth appreciating, into something that's nourishing for me. And that might be taking on maybe some, like the rules in your condo, right? You know, maybe your homeowners association, or some local laws, or, you know, or whatever it is that you know, like you've been eating this crap and all of a sudden you're saying, like, you know what, like I can't take this anymore. This is just not nourishing to me, right? And so we have to take some kind of effective action. And that's why, like, wood works with the earth in this way, right? The hun and the yi, along with the shen of the heart, the shen, helps us to transform our life into something that's nourishing, but it comes from a very thoughtful place, not a reactive place, right? There's an intention behind it. And if you look at yi intention, I think it also includes the character. It's like the foundational part of the character, I think, is the heart, is the image for the heart. So, you know, it gives us our capacity for righteousness and integrity, right? If you think about just the integrity of the vessels, the integrity of the flesh, things aren't leaking out with edema. Things aren't leaking out like hemorrhaging. Things aren't leaking out of our lower orifices like prolapses, right? The earth gives us integrity. We want integrity under our feet. Like, we don't want sinkholes, right? That's scary. You're walking along and all of a sudden you like fall into the earth. That's terrifying, right? So that's earth out of balance. So earth is about the integrity of our intention, and that has to be rooted in the heart. And interestingly enough, the spleen channel ends at spleen 21 and begins the next channel at heart 1. So there's a lot of relationships between the yi and the shen of the heart, and how this intention, our thoughtfulness and integrity, actually stems from our alignment with our inner heart. Right? So that has a lot to do with, if you're a more Confucian person, how you conduct your affairs in the world. Like, are you thoughtful? Are you considerate? And also with wood allows us to see people's other perspectives, right? So there's a lot of combination between these three shen. Any questions about that? Okay, let's take a break until 5 of. Let's take 10 minutes and then we'll come back at 9:55. You got a 12-minute break. So I just wanted to speak briefly about what impairs the spleen. So one of the main things that impairs the spleen is qi deficiency. Now, this could come from a lack of food, and like a certain amount of food. This could also come from the lack of a certain type of food that the person needs. It comes from a lack of water, right? It could also, there's some kind of internal process going on that impairs the proper taking in of the amount of food or the processing of the food itself. Another thing that impairs the spleen is a deficiency of yang qi, which can be accompanied by kidney yang deficiency. External damp heat can impact, right? So living in environments that are extremely damp or hot and damp, you know, thinking about some aspects of the tropics where there's a lot of humidity as well as high heat, right? Now the spleen does like to be a little bit on the dry side, but it doesn't want necessarily too much dryness. So arid areas where the heat can go in and it damages the fluids, right? So, you know, places that are like have more of like a desert kind of quality to them. Any of you have ever been to New Mexico or Arizona in the summer? You know, it just like the heat just like wicks the moisture like right out of your pores. Before you know it, you're extremely thirsty, and you know you've been drinking a fair amount of water, but the sun just like it just sucks the air right out. It sucks the moisture right out of your body. Another one is from being overly controlled horizontally from the liver. So if the liver is exuberant, which can also be affected by damp heat, and then becomes very stagnant, and then the liver qi is not able to course in its normal directions, and then it either goes up or it goes down or it goes sideways, which is more common, and then starts to impact the spleen and stomach. All right. And Liu Wangsu, I think that was his name, Liu Wansu, he was like the school of like heat and cooling and purging. He's actually one of my favorites. He's from 1120 to 1200, I think, and he wrote some important texts about you know, the effects and the damages of heat on the system. And he said that people are relatively more yang and warm. So any type of internal dampness in the right conditions will almost always certainly turn into damp heat. And one of the main culprits of that is that the food and the drink that we eat. And, you know, there's a current, like, you know, it's very, like, what would you say? It's like, it's very popular these days to eat extremely spicy foods, right? Extremely spicy foods. And that can generate a little bit too much internal heat. And we also like a lot of like fried foods. We like alcohol. So there's a lot of dampness, damp heat, sugar. Oh my God, sugar is in everything, right? And that is, you know, damp heat on a biscuit. I mean, it's just, sugar is just, I mean, there was a time in ancient China where actually that was, all the sugar was kept in a cabinet, and there was only one eunuch, very trusted eunuch, who had like the key to this cabinet. It was like sort of treated like how we treat, you know, morphine in the hospitals. It was like, you know, in case of emergency, break glass. It was not commonly used or dispensed, right? And we love sugar, right? I mean, it's hot, it's damp, it's comforting, it's exciting, right? I mean, it makes us feel comfortable. All right, until it doesn't. All right. So no questions about the spleen. You guys feel pretty clear about it? All right. I think maybe, yeah, actually I want to speak to this before we get into the points one more time. I'm sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry. This is actually something that's clinically useful and important. One of the big barriers to treatment that I see in people of like across every, you know, category, I mean, just it affects everyone to some degree, some more than others, is this aspect, especially earth CFs though, that's why I bring it up now, is this quality, and you see it a lot in metal CFs, is shame, guilt and shame. This can be a really big barrier because for some people who are really embedded in the stories and past experiences and their interpretations of past experiences that embed them in guilt, embed them in shame. I mean, we've all made mistakes. That's how we walk through life. And there's actually like different types of people, and like 4 out of the 5 major types of people like learn by trial and error, right? So for the vast majority of us, I just think of like, I don't mean to inject religion into this, but there's a spiritual quote that I think is interesting. Like there's this sort of a hadith, this saying of Muhammad alayhi salam, that he was told by the angel Gabriel, who got it from God, that said the human being was meant to make mistakes. If you were perfect and never made mistakes, I'd create another race that did. I just thought that was interesting. And if you take all the religious part out of it and just look at us from like this raw humanity, I mean, who doesn't make mistakes, right? But what's our relationship to that? And earth CFs and metal CFs can have a really tough relationship with guilt and shame. And I think guilt and shame is kind of a collapse of yang. So from the standpoint of earth, it's kind of more of an existential nature, and to some metal CFs too. And there's this quality of like, there's something like, there's the judgment of wood and metal that says there's something wrong with me. And again, think about metal, like wood controls earth and metal sedates earth, right? It keeps it from like, moving along, or enhances its, or inhibits its movement along the Schenck cycle, given whether it's excess or deficiency. And if you think about this, either like human judgment or like value judgment on its effect on the earth, it can sedate the earth, or it can over control the earth. Either way, it makes it stagnant. And so a stagnant earth requires more comfort, physically, emotionally. So we end up like being stuck in this vicious cycle of doing the thing that makes us feel comfortable, but it has a negative effect on us. Then we feel more guilt, and then we do it more to alleviate the suffering, the mental anguish of that. So we feel more comfortable. And when that goes on too long, we start to feel shame. And so there's this quality of relationship between reciprocity and symbiosis, between, hedonism and greed, and, nourishment and comfort. And I would say, like, if it's more of like guilt and shame for things that we haven't done, that we've neglected to do, that is more for me about like tonifying and nourishing the blood of the spleen, right? And then for things that we have done excessively, maybe work more on the stomach to kind of process that. So that would be things like stomach 40, stomach 36, maybe stomach 9, stomach 8, to nourish the blood and the chi and the spleen. That would be like spleen 10, spleen 8, spleen 6, definitely spleen 3, maybe clearing like some of the heat that builds up by spleen 2 and spleen 1. So I think, so when the stomach is weak, excess turbidity develops. When the spleen is weak, excess damp arises. So dampness, when we talk about dampness, which definitely affects the spleen and stomach, it's like humidity, it's like rain. And so if both the stomach and spleen are weak, then this dampness starts to develop because of this chi is not transforming and transporting things. So things start to like build up and stagnate. Think about like the development of like a lot of adipose tissue around the middle jowl, right? I mean, that's where it lands first, right? The middle, because that's where all the functional aspects of digestion takes place and transformation take place. And then over time, dampness turns into phlegm, and phlegm is more like mud, and phlegm is hard to move, right? So these pathological factors then in turn, as they develop, obstruct the flow of chi and blood, and they tend to impede metabolism and vitality. So that not only affects the body, but think about the damp and the phlegm on the mental, emotional level. So these might be from substances, these might be from activities or tendencies or proclivities that give us temporary comfort, but over time keep us stuck. And then the more we get stuck, the more dampness accumulates. And then eventually that dampness, that stagnation generates heat, and then that generates phlegm, right? And that becomes like, this sort of like, what do you call it? Like a stuck, established negative behavior pattern that obscures and obstructs our clear thinking of the mind, and it obstructs our connection to our heart, which knows what we need. So, for those of us and those of our patients who are really stuck in this vicious cycle of comfort, relief, guilt, shame, and then, okay, then I need more comfort, which gives me some relief, but then I feel guilty, then I feel shame, right? Spleen stomach, especially spleen, is going to be really good. So that is a good segue to spleen 1, which is the Jing-Well point. And that is a point that, like many Jing-Well points, are said to restore consciousness because it provokes a powerful stimulation of movement of qi, right? It's the Jing-Well point, it's the wood point. So it's again, in its balanced state, the co-cycle is actually a tonifying relationship, right? Not only does it restrain it from becoming excess, right, but it imparts a qualitative influence and virtues that help that official do what it needs to do in a balanced way, right? So it's like, you've got the push of the Sheng cycle and the pull of the Ko cycle, which helps us to maintain balance and stability. And so that's flavored with the quality of wood here, and wood adds structure, right? So that's why it's really good for stopping bleeding. So if you read about the indications, it's really great for stopping bleeding. It's really good for regulating the spleen, and we'll get into that. It's said to unbind the chest because the yin Jing-Well points, the yin meridian Jing-Well points, right? Again, where does the yin meridians begin and end, right? Where do those meridians begin and end? The entry-exit points for the yin channels are all beginning and ending either on the extremities or the chest, right? For the yang, it's the extremities and the face and head, right? So stomach 1 starts here, stomach 45 ends on the foot. Spleen 1 starts on the foot, ends on the chest, right? Heart 1, yin, begins on the chest, ends on the hands, the extremities, right? Small intestine 1, right? It begins here on the extremities, ends on the face or head, right? So the yin Jing-Wells have a powerful effect on, like, again, it's about movement, right? It's about aggressive, intense movement, moving stagnation. And it tends to help the other end of the channel, right? Not vice versa generally. I wouldn't do spleen 1 for toe problems, spleen 21 for toe problems, excuse me, right? But spleen 1 can have a very powerful effect on the area around spleen 21, which is the side of the chest and along the chest, right? If you look at where the spleen channel goes, it goes through the chest. So that's why it says it unbinds the chest. Well, how does it do that? Through these superficial and deep pathways at the opposite end of the channel as a Jing-Well point. And wood is about coursing things, giving things space to move. So, you infuse spleen 1 with this, wood flavor. It's about structure. It's about waking up. It's about stepping forward. It's about boldness, right? It's about opening and coursing the qi so we can relax, so we can be free to move, right? And so on the other end of the chest is the diaphragm, right? The serratus muscles, right? The latissimus muscles, the pectoral muscles. So this helps like free the diaphragm, unbind the chest. And so when that happens, and again, the qi is moving smoothly from spleen 21 to heart 1, then if the qi is free to move in the chest, then the heart can relax. So that's why it says it calms the heart and the spirit, right? Because the spirit is happier and more calm when it's present and awake, right? So that's the calming Shen, right? So when you read about these actions and indications, in Deadman and other books, like, you have to understand, like, how is that action, like, what's behind that action? What's the mechanism of efficacy, as I like to say, right? So, according to lots of, post-classical texts like, Sun Si Miao's 1,000 Ducat formulas, the spleen gathers the blood And when the spleen is deficient, it's unable to unite the blood. That means it's not able to keep the blood where it's supposed to be, when it's supposed to be, right? How it's supposed to be, right? So another post-classical text, I think it's called the Treatise on Disorders of Blood, right? It states when the spleen yang is deficient, it's unable to gather the blood. So this is really a phenomenal point for chronic spleen qi deficiency, and maybe even spleen yang deficiency, leading to an inability to hold the blood where it's supposed to be in its proper place. And that often shows up, and that's almost always going to be a chronic spleen qi deficiency. And the most common place you'll see that is through excessively heavy uterine bleeding during menses. As I mentioned, two of the things that really built my practice was pain, people coming in to see me for pain. They've gone to everyone else and they couldn't get any relief, and menstrual disorders. So I had to very quickly learn, the ins and outs and facets of the which obviously as a man I'm not familiar with, right? So I don't have any sisters, and you're certainly going to talk about it with your mother. So, I had to really do a lot of research into this. And, one of the most common problems was a lot of pain during the menstrual cycle, as well as excessive bleeding, because people are like, these days, and, really for a long time, women have like a tremendous amount of obligations. Like they're like at home taking care of kids, with their partners, but they're also like working, and they're also like managing the finances. And I'm not saying this is like women in general. I'm talking about the patients that I experience. I'm not making a statement about gender. This is not a socio-political statement about gender and women's roles. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the patients that came through my door. This is what they were dealing with. They were either on their own, or especially like I had a lot of single mothers as patients. And they're like working incredibly hard. So, they get worn down. Spleen, kidney yin would start to like become deficient. Kidney yang would become deficient. And therefore, the fires of Mingmen, the fires of the kidneys, that help the earth organs do what they need to do, they weren't getting the, spleen and stomach weren't getting the nourishment they needed. And so they'd end up getting weak. And also they didn't have time to like eat great and pamper themselves. These weren't women sitting around eating bonbons all day. They were like working. And so, spleen and stomach would become deficient, dampness would result. And then eventually they might get like prolapses, uterine prolapse, vaginal prolapse. So spleen 1, heavy menstrual bleeding. So this is an outstanding point for, again, resolving damp, enhancing the integrity of the spleen to hold things in place. So powerful for helping, regulate the menstrual cycle along with the wood. Spleen 1's not so much about timing; it's just about holding the blood in place. So I would even give like moxa sticks, or even like these tiger warmers, which is like a really like, it's almost like a moxa roll, but super narrow, like pencil thin. And I would have them like peck moxa, not touching, over spleen 1, like, 2-3 times a day. There was a couple that I gave moxa to put direct moxa, but these were people who were like super reliable. They weren't inclined to like flake out and burn themselves and then blame me. Because, obviously the main priority is I don't want their patients to hurt themselves, right? And so this was like a really great treatment for them to peck moxa, not touch, but get close to moxa spleen 1, sometimes putting like helping them massage it, right? Or having them come in like a couple times a week. So this is a really phenomenal point for helping uterine bleeding, menorrhagia, or blood in the stools, nosebleeds, blood in the urine, which occasionally would occur, especially more with men, but also with like a lot of damp heat in the lower jiao from like bladder infections. And it's also good for agitation or fullness in the chest. Again, think about like the spleen's not transforming the fluids in the chest. It's not even maybe even making it through the diaphragm. So this is really good to combine with other points for anxiety, especially the type of anxiety that I see among all caretakers of every gender, of every type, binary, non-binary, like people who are like, resonate a lot with the wood and the earth, and they're very nurturing and thoughtful, and maybe to a fault they don't know boundaries. So this is a really good like boundary setting point, like to really check in with one's body. Am I giving too much? Am I giving enough? And some people would have a lot of guilt and anxiety around that, or their obligations would weigh so heavily on them that was making them anxious, hard to sleep. So yes, this would be also a good point for hemorrhoids to combine with other points, because you have to clear the heat out of the lower jiao as well. That might be like expanding and pushing out the rectum. And so this is a nice point for like prolapses of any kind, including hemorrhoids. Really nice point. And again, a lot of that is because the spleen, stomach, and maybe even like the kidneys are overtaxed, right? And so the integrity of things. So it's said to be good for things like excessive dreaming and insomnia. And I would say the type of insomnia is like the hard to shut the mind down. So the wood is about like creating structure, and structure implies boundaries. So this is really good for people on all levels, physical as well as mental, emotional, for instilling boundaries. Very important point. Let's see. So what else did I want to say? Oh yeah. Also think about like severe spleen Qi deficiency and diarrhea. So that's sort of like, hemorrhoids of the stool. So there's not enough transformation and transformation of what we eat and drink. And so like diarrhea, things just like fall out. The contents of the stools due to heat is not being fully absorbed and held in, right? So similarly, that heat can rise up, combined with damp, get stuck in the head, and that could create that like constant worry, obsessive quality, hard to quiet the mind at night, and thus the insomnia. Again, this has a powerful control in the blood. The blood is more active, I think, at night, right? So this is also good for creating boundaries around our cravings. So this is really good for somebody who craves a lot of like sweet foods, or has a lot of powerful cravings that kind of like take over their capacity for self-control. Like every day I think like, is this a fudgesicle day? Like, okay, like, it's like I have this craving, but I notice when I have more of this craving than other times. And it's generally when I need more, like more spleen sweetness in my life. Maybe I feel like I've been like overly working, right? So on another sense, if there's too much wood over controlling, then that can clog the earth, right? Things get root bound. So the patient might feel very stifled and overly stifled from too much structure imposed on them from the exterior, from outside, like rules and things like that. So we get maybe hyper focused on our goals, hyper focused on our responsibilities, and we're not able to enjoy the little satisfying moments and the little successes along the way. It's like, it doesn't have to just be about the final outcome, like what little landmarks along the way can I stop and enjoy and savor that indicate I've been making progress, right? And then if it's deficient, not enough wood, then earth erodes. Like think about if there's not enough grass or foliage on a hillside and it's just, dirt, like it just erodes. Like the wind blows the dirt away, the rain washes the dirt away. So, this is also people from like who are like their minds and spirits are kind of like spinning off in four directions. They don't have the scattered quality of like fire, but it's more like they just seem really out of it. And they just seem lost. They have no vision. They have no clarity, no sense of purpose, right? And then over time, their spirit can suffer and they become like kind of agitated by that. Another aspect of it is like we have some experience that's really hard to digest, that was upsetting for us, and we don't really know how to integrate it. So this is really helpful to like help create a plan about how to be with those things that are out of our control, especially from the past, but maybe also in the future and present. So, right, think about like enhancing the capacity for integrity, right? The wood and the earth working together gives us integrity, right? Gives the soil integrity. It's not eroding away. That's our principles. And maybe even our own flesh out of our work is like we're eroding away because like we're so consumed with our responsibilities and obligations that we don't feed ourselves, that we don't take care of ourselves, right? That we don't nourish ourselves in body and mind. So there's going to be a lot of lack of that shows up, you know, where somebody feels kind of uncentered, unstable. They're kind of like easily, you know, influenced one way or the other, right? Because they don't know how to like really like stand and be rooted in what their needs are. Like, you know, I have a rule for my patients, you know, your needs precede and override other people's wants. But you have to be clear, connected to your heart about what it is that you really need and differentiate that from what is just a simple mental ego level preference, right? Like if it's time to feed your child, but you want to watch TV, like maybe you need a break, but guess what? Like maybe when you check in with your heart, like actually, yeah, okay, I really go need to feed my kid dinner. Right? All right, any questions about that? All right, so like I said, this is a really great point to create boundaries and structure. So this is an awesome point for obsessiveness, obsessive compulsive behavior. People become very self-absorbed. They're kind of like stuck in their own minds and heads, and to the point where it might even interfere with their ability to sleep. Okay. So spleen 2. That's Great Metropolis. Okay, so this is a fire point. It's a tonification point. It's a yin spring point. So like all yin spring points, even on the yin, this is really good for clearing heat. So, you know, if you kind of can help clear some of the residual heat, that takes the pressure off the spleen and stomach, and it makes it a little bit more easy to resolve any kind of damp conditions. So the capital, you know, like it's Dadu, like great capital, big city, right? Du, in this case, refers to the commercial part of the city where there's the abundance of like the whole region is brought for exchange. So it's like, you know, like the farmer's market, like, I don't know if you've ever been to like Baltimore City, you know, before the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, in the spring and summer, all the way up until actually the last Sunday before Christmas, you know, there was like this giant farmer's market. But if you think about like your local farmer's market, like these, you know, people bring in on trucks, right, all the goods from their farm to this central location, this hub of activity, right? Maybe the city, or maybe a more populous place where there's more activity, more mercantilism, right? And so then they bring that there for sale. So this is a place where you can experience a lot of abundance, where there's a lot of transformation of chi. That's like exchange of goods for money. That's a transformation of chi, right? That's what that implies. That's used for your daily life. You know, you go and you buy the arugula, you go and you buy the mustard greens, you go and you buy your beets or your flowers or your honey or your sausage, whatever, right? And then you go, and then that's what nourishes you, right? So there's this transformation going on that's fueled by the yang qi that's available here as a tonification point. And that requires a certain amount of heat and fire and yang, right? So sometimes the fire might be burning too low, and thus you get indigestion, stagnation, especially in the middle jiao, right? So that's why it's said, you know, it harmonizes the middle jiao and clears heat, right? So what's happening is like, you know, there's not enough transformation and exchange happening. So dampness builds up in the middle jiao, which can develop, then stagnate things and develop into heat, right? It's said to regulate the spleen. So what does it mean by that? How does it regulate the spleen? By this transformational process of balancing the heat and cool in the middle jiao, so things are digested and transformed and transported, right? So if it's deficient, you get spleen yang deficiency or cold damp patterns. All right, so if it's deficient, you get spleen yang deficiency. If there's not enough heat and not enough warmth, right, you get spleen yang deficiency, you get cold damp problems. So that shows up as like a lethargic mind, lethargic body, muddled thinking, slow or poor, sluggish digestion, might show up as cold extremities. Again, the yang goes from the center to the periphery, right? So it's not that heat, that warmth isn't making it out from the center to the more distal regions. How else can it show up? You know, like if there's sluggish digestion, you get like a lot of abdominal distension. And then if there's and then again, so remember always like deficiency leads to stagnation, and then stagnation leads to deficiency, right? But stagnation often also simultaneously, chronic stagnation leads to heat. So if there's excessive heat, then, you know, you get a lot of like stronger, more intense epigastric pain, acid reflux, abdominal distension, you know, maybe even like agitation when hungry. There's like a sense of dizziness sometimes, right? Because it's stirring the wind. Agitation, insomnia, right? Maybe like a bitter taste in your mouth. So this is a really good point for clearing the excessive heat or stimulating some more warmth that the spleen needs to balance its digestive functions, right? Yeah, so, you know, you can kind of tell if it's deficient or excess by kind of the nature of what happens after someone eats. If it's excessive, there's generally going to be a lot of like quick to feel bloating. You know, they'll quickly feel abdominal distension. It might even be more of like a sharper pain or like a fixed, like more boring type pain, you know, or like sudden or very soon, like rebellious chi that comes with a sense of heat or agitation, like heartburn, acid reflux, right? Regurgitation, right? Because remember, yang goes up, right? So if it's more yin, they're going to feel a little bit more vaguely sluggish, heavy, right? They may even feel cold after eating. They'll feel kind of like muzzy headed, maybe like a little out of it, like, you know, like a food coma kind of thing. Brain freeze, like, you know, like when you're eating ice cream too fast on a hot day, right? You get that sort of brain freeze. So on a mental emotional level, this can show up as someone's obsessions and the things that they think about, like what they focus their intentions on, can become very consuming and agitating to their mind and spirit. And that will generally show up in a yang presentation. They'll seem a little manic, a little obsessive, maybe obsessive compulsive. You know, like I think about a friend of mine from acupuncture school, actually. She was definitely an earth CF with like earth within and maybe fire as the third. And like every time we would like go out to hang out, we would like leave her apartment and we would literally have to go back in 3, sometimes 4 times to make sure she turned the oven off. And she wasn't even cooking. So, and she'd be kind of like get into these like manic kind of hyper phases. And so, you know, she would turn to alcohol to kind of try and subdue that. But alcohol is not called fire water for nothing, right? So that actually ended up like adding more damp heat, which agitated her spirit more. So I was like, you know, I think maybe you would do well to get some treatment. And so, you know, like she talked about how like basically her practitioner was just like clearing heat and resolving damp with like every treatment. And she was a little bit doughy, you know, she was kind of like slightly well upholstered, you know, so clearing a lot of that was definitely very helpful. Similarly, someone may be like working their gulik off, but not getting the fruits of their efforts, the fruits of their labors, and that leaves them feeling very barren and cold, right? And so they get kind of resigned. Or think about spleen yang deficiency, cold, like I'm resigned, I feel heavy, I'm unmotivated, right? I don't feel satisfied, I don't feel nourished. So this is a nice point for that. I always think of like Bruce Springsteen's song, Everybody's Got a Hungry Heart. I always think about that song for this. Right? So this is very tonifying, especially when you tonify. It is the tonification point. So this is really indicated for any kind of spleen weakness or deficiency. So this helps to tonify its capacity to, both its yin and yang capacities to resolve dampness, transform what we eat into us, keep things from stagnating, especially in the middle jiao, keep things moving so they don't build up, okay? Let's see. What did I want to say about this? Oh yeah, that's for the next point. Yeah, and so one of the ways that sluggishness can show up in deficiency is edema or heaviness and edema in the limbs and in the face. Right? So that's an underlying spleen deficiency. All right. So spleen 3, supreme white. It's the earth point. It's the source point. It's the Harari point. It's the Shu stream point. So this is probably the most tonifying point on the spleen channel. I would say, like, you know, if someone's got a lot of like spleen deficiency, inability to like process what we eat and drink, you know, there's a lot of like there's like a lot of churning, borborygmus, right? It's difficult to digest. Also mentally, there's a lot of spinning thoughts. They're kind of like stuck in their head, not in a manic way, but in a relatively calm way. But it's, you can still see that they're like constantly chewing, constantly chewing, constantly chewing, constantly chewing. And again, that may be their inner superpower, but as a medicine, it has its dosage and its timing. So, you know, like for a long time, I was treating a lot of engineers that like, and I still do, at Northrop Grumman, or the Defense Department, or NASA. I get like I don't know why, like I have this cadre of like of women that work at NASA who all come in with like basically this same problem. It's really fascinating, and a lot of them know each other, and they're just like this cadre of like really high level, highly accomplished engineers. They're all like project managers, and they're in positions of authority. They've got like teams of anywhere from like 5 to like 100 people, and they're all like brilliant. I mean, they're just like a foot smarter than just about everyone I know, and they all are like damp and they're all like kind of cold, and they all just like, they just process and process and process. And while that's like, you know, that's what they use to like be phenomenally, you know, excellent at their jobs, you know, there is a time that like that's not necessarily what needs to be going on 100% of the time. And they all come in and they have the like same issues, like I have trouble losing weight, I have trouble with digestion, and I have trouble falling asleep because I can't turn my mind off. So this point, I think about like the earth and the earth. And the earth, what's the nature of the earth? It spins, right? And so this is a really great point for harmonizing and regulating the proper spin. Not too fast, not too slowly, right? Just right. So it's very grounding. It regulates the spin. It regulates the spin of like digestion, right? Think about the spin this way, like ascending, descending, ascending, descending, moving things. Like the spin allows some centripetal force to go out to the periphery and also provides mass and gravity to come back, right? So this is said to be a point that tonifies the spleen and resolves damp and damp heat. And it harmonizes the spleen and stomach. So how does it do that? So it makes sure each the stomach and spleen is doing its part in its relationship and its communication with the other. So the turbid is rising as it should, right? And then the products of digestion are descending as they should. That the spleen is helping to bring some of the turbid fluids up from the stomach, right, to the lungs, to the heart, to help create the blood, as well as to help create the Wei Qi, right, as well as like transforming and transporting the products of our digestion, right? So when it says it regulates qi, what does that mean? It makes sure that the organ system is doing its job. So any organ that's doing its job is creating zheng qi, right? So the zheng qi of the spleen means it's correct. Like the qi of the spleen is correct in its natural functions on a body, mind, spirit level, right? And so, you know, for the stomach, this means it's starting to process things. It brings the turbidity up to help form the blood, to help form the Wei Qi, right? To descend the products of digestion down into the intestines. So this is a phenomenal point on so many physical levels. It's also a shoestring point, right? So there's a quote from chapter 6 of the Spiritual Pivot. It's, let me see if I just want to make sure I get it right, that when the 5 zong are diseased, the 5 yin organs of disease, again, because there was no pericardium then, select from the 12 yuan source points. So this is really good for any kind of deficiency of the zong fu in general, as well as the spleen and stomach in particular. And especially when there's some kind of deficiency, right? So someone might not be getting enough quantity of nourishment. Again, somebody might be very financially challenged. They might suffer from poverty. They might suffer from access to nourishing foods, right? You think about different areas of the city, you know, where I grew up, was like, there's a lot of like food deserts, less so now, thank God. But, you know, like I remember a time when there's really only like a couple of grocery stores in all of Baltimore City, like a couple of big grocery stores and a couple like smaller markets. And then, you know, thankfully that's grown. But I remember like in all of East Baltimore, there was like a Safeway and a Mars, and that was it. So you had to, like, you know, not everybody has easy access or financial resources, you know, to access. So there might be a deficiency of quantity, there might be a deficiency of quality, right? So this is really good, especially with moxa, to help stimulate the spleen's capacity and the stomach's capacity to efficiently get the most out of every little thing that we eat and drink, right? So if that deficiency goes on long enough, then there's an accumulation of dampness and eventually damp heat. And so how do you tell this? By the pulse. So if you're not sure if something is deficient or excess, if it's excess, generally look for things that happen rapidly, right? Symptoms that occur rapidly or soon after eating, or things that come on suddenly, or any kind of experience of heat or agitation that's, like, again, relatively more quick. Let's see. And then for cold, things are just going to be like more sluggish and slower. The person might actually feel cold, feel kind of heavy, right? And you'll also go by the tongue and pulse. So if there is full cold, there might be a little bit of a pounding quality, but it'll be very slippery, and the tongue will probably be more wet and swollen, okay? There'll be more scallops. Okay. For heat and damp heat, there's going to be like the coat. Well, for damp cold, it's going to be maybe thick and white. For damp heat, it's going to be thick and more on the yellowish side, even brown, maybe even a greenish tint. Okay. And it will be dry. So deficiency is going to be more wet. It's not processing the fluids, they're accumulating. Deficiency, like this, like from an excess of heat, generally the tongue is going to be drier. Does this make sense? I hope this is helpful, right? So basically, when there's an underlying spleen qi deficiency, and I'm talking about the spleen in general here because it's so relevant to the functions of this point. So when, you know, if there's a lot of exterior damp heat, or a lot of interior damp heat, either from environmental factors or from our diet, either a lack of, nourishing foods, or a lack of like the amount of nourishing foods, or we're eating too fast, or we're not able to eat enough, right? Or we're eating like too heavy foods, right? That weakens the spleen. I'm sorry, my notes there's a little bit of a breeze coming through my room here, and it's blowing my notes around. So if there's a lot of damp heat that this penetrates or builds up inside, what you're going to see is like about three main things. So one is there's going to be some kind of underlying spleen Qi deficiency, which you'll feel on the pulse. The pulse will feel weak. The pulse will feel quite slippery. You'll see it on the tongue, like swollen tongue, maybe wet, maybe a lot of scallops, right? Maybe a lot of buildup of coat, maybe even like a big stomach line crack, because now it's affecting the stomach too. And the integrity of the flesh, right? So how that's going to injure us is basically like three main ways. Firstly, it can combine with, like, again, remember the stomach and spleen, the byproducts go to create our Wei Qi. So your Wei Qi might become deficient, and therefore you're more easily, or the patient's more easily penetrated by exterior pathogenic factors. And this is going to quickly give rise to symptoms that you're all familiar with like, fever, chills and fever, fullness and oppression. Over time, if it's really severe, an inability to lie down because the fluids are not being transformed. So when you lay down, the lungs get filled up with fluid. It's hard to breathe through the sinuses, right? They're all clogged up. The lungs fill up with fluid. They might feel a lot of heaviness in the head. Again, wind becomes like cold, heat, and that obstructs the sinus passages, right? So that's like your normal colds and flus, right? So, you have to look, if you feel like a lot of weakness in the middle jiao pulses, especially on the right-hand side, and they've got like a cold or flu, you have to understand there's probably, and you look at their tongue, there's probably an underlying spleen Qi deficiency. Now, again, that might not be the first needles you deal with. You want to expel the external pathogenic factor, but you also have to come in behind that, either in that treatment or later treatments, to tonify the spleen and stomach. Spleen 3, stomach 36, spleen 6, right? So one way of dampness and damp heat leading to underlying spleen Qi deficiency, right? It affects the body in three ways. It weakens our immune system, so we're more easily invaded, and we get colds and flus more easily. That's the first way. Second is, and this is like not super common unless we live in a very damp, hot environment. So, you think about like the tropics, places where there's like a lot of rain, like my sister-in-law's from Vietnam, and where she was in Vietnam, it was like, it was very hot, very humid. They have like a monsoon season. So, that may be a direct attack to the spleen and stomach, giving rise to like a lot of internal damp heat affecting the organ system. So this is going to be like a lot of diarrhea, maybe even dysentery. You think about dysentery disorders. There's like a lot of fullness in the middle jiao. They might even like vomiting a lot, can't keep any food down, a lot of heat in the body over time. Like they just feel hot all the time. They may or may not even have a fever, but they just feel hot a lot. And it agitates their mind, right? So it's sort of like, like the fevers you get in like a lot of jungle environments, right? But that's not something you'll see a lot. The third, which is like people who work a lot outdoors and are exposed to the elements a lot, this is in the form of like wind and wind damp. So this can enter the channels, giving rise to painful obstruction. That's B obstruction syndrome, right? So there's a lot of internal damp. The deficiency creates a lot of internal damp, and this internal damp is like flypaper. Will you experience a pounding quality in the spleen position? If it's an exterior factor, yes. If you get like a pounding, that's probably going to either be a lot of heat that you'll feel like just at the surface of the pulse, not like pounding deep down, um, or like sudden like exposures, right? Things like that. That's going to be like more of the pounding, like, you know, like full heat creates the pounding. So thirdly is like what you, the sort of like the arthritic conditions that some people get where their diet is very damp oriented. You know, they eat a lot of fried foods, they eat a lot of sugar, they drink a lot of alcohol, especially beer, right? And then they kind of like do a lot of work outdoors, or they work in environments where there's a lot of changing of like temperature. Like, so for example, when I worked in my friend's liquor store, you know, you got to go into the box, you know, like the cooler where we store things, right? It's very cold in there. And then you come out and it's summertime and it's hot. And then you go back in and it's cold. So people like coming in and out of like offices a lot, people who are exposed to the elements. So this internal damp acts as like a flypaper in which like these external pathogenic factors stick. And it's not like they're living in a damp heat environment. It's more like, you know, regular environments, but, you know, they're exposed to a lot of wind, they're exposed to a lot of changing seasons, they're exposed to a lot of like rainy weather, they work outside in the rain, right? I think about my grandfather who like worked for Baltimore Gas and Electric for like 45 years. And for a long time, he was like a linesman and, you know, worked in like the building substations. And so a lot of that's outdoors. People like do a lot of gardening, you know, people do a lot of like around the housework. So, you know, this basically what happens is it like the damp kind of traps the wind or the hot or the cold in the channel level in the joints. And so that manifests as heaviness in the body, painful obstruction that's worse when the weather changes, right? You know, like my grandmother, she could always tell when it was raining. She's like, oh, my hip's starting to hurt. It's going to rain, right? You know, right? That barometric pressure change is wind, and then it's about to rain, and that's damp, right? So that's wind damp. So these are the things that are like really good to help with. And then if that third aspect of like that flypaper internal damp, you know, capturing and sticking these external pathogenic factors, if that goes on too long and the qi becomes too obstructed for too long, then you get what's called Wei atrophy syndrome. And this is like chronic B obstruction where you lose muscle tone, you lose muscle strength, the nerves start to get affected. So this is where like you lose your grip, you lose your strength, the muscles become more flaccid. And this happens to a lot of athletes, especially in impact sports, right? So on a mental emotional level, this is really great for like when there's a lot of spinning, there's a lack of integrity. You know, people are like, well, I know I shouldn't, but this person really needs my help. And so I'm going to give them money that I can't really afford to give because they're suffering and I want to be nice and thoughtful. So that's like, you know, you allow others to penetrate your boundaries, violate your boundaries. It erodes your integrity and your principles, both in terms of your physical resources of qi and energy, right? Or your other resources like your time, your money, your thoughtful attention, right? So this is really a good point for, you know, people who are like excessive givers. This is also a point for people who are like very thoughtless, like I am the center of my universe. You know, I remember I had this one tenant in this place where we rented, like it was like, I used to call her 70-30, because unless she got 70% of like whatever and I got 30%, unless it was like that, then we weren't equal. Like she always felt like, well, can't you give me a break on the rent? Because I'm like, no, this is the rent. This is what it is. You pay the rent on this time at this date, right? And for that, you get what you get, right? So it was like, and this person like had like actually like a lot of money. Like it was like a lot of this woe is me kind of thing. So you'll see a lot of that, like a lot of earth. They're like, instead of like being thoughtful to others, they're really mostly just thoughtful about themselves, and they just become like this sort of like their gravity starts to increase. Like they want more and to be filled more, right? They're like this, you know, chasm of need that can never be filled. Like this is a great point to moxa for people like that, especially when you combine it with bladder 20 and bladder 49, the outer bladder line point for the spleen. Like, okay, yes, there's actually a lot that you are getting and there's a lot around you that can be nourishing. All right. So let's take a 10-minute break.
Condition.
Yes.
What was the name of condition that you said? Atrophy. I didn't hear the
Wei
first part.
atrophy. WEI dash atrophy. Wei atrophy. WEI atrophy. Right. All right. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back for a couple minutes after 11, and then we will continue with spleen. Okay, so spleen 4, prince's grandson or grandfather grandson, or grandmother granddaughter, or prince's granddaughter. The way JR used to talk about this point, he's like, imagine, you know, how much like grandparents love to spoil their grandkids, but then imagine your grandparent is royalty. Like, wow, you're just getting the best of everything. You know, you're just everything is just going to be like the best. You're going to be like so well cared for, so well protected. Hopefully, you know, obviously in ideal situations. So I think about this point, this sort of lusciousness of this point, you know, the resources available at this point, and the main resources it uses as a low point is the blood. And so this is actually a point that is a powerful invigorator of the blood. The name Gongsun, while it does mean grandfather, grandson, it also is the family name, supposedly, of the Yellow Emperor and Huangdi, and he was the one who united the tribes of the Huanghe Yellow River valleys and plains around the Yellow River in the, I think it's called the Shaanxi. And so, you know, this was actually taking place during the Earth phase of Chinese history. So, you know, there's this quality of earth, there's this quality of uniting, right? There's this quality of power. And so as a low point, this is really good at helping to regulate the blood. Its actions, its most notable actions are to regulate the qi and the blood of the penetrating vessel, which is known as the Chongmai, right? So it's actually the master point, the opening point of the Chongmai. This is one of the 8 extraordinary vessels. You'll learn more about these later. But this is also a very powerful point for dealing with the flow of blood and invigorating the movement of blood, and also enhancing the quality of the blood. So it's, in a lot of technical books, it's talked about in terms of like its ability to harmonize the middle jiao. So anytime you hear low point, think about communication and harmony. And harmony is actually created through communication. So, you know, the spleen channel is sort of like being the grandfather, and the stomach channel is sort of like the grandchild. You know, alternatively, this is like how we look at the functions of the spleen and stomach together, right? So as a low point, it connects to the source point of the stomach, stomach 32. So it also draws from the influences of the stomach, right? So it has a lot to do with sort of processing and moving, right? There's a quality of invigoration here. So this is a really phenomenal point on any level, physical, mental, emotional level, that's indicated by blood stasis, right? So stasis of blood literally in the body. Also like thinking about like blood as the matrix of our consciousness. So stagnation in terms of like, you know, your sense of identity, stagnation in terms of like your ability to move through life with comfort and grace, right? So on a physical level, you know, what I find myself doing this mostly for is supporting conception and fertility, is for dysmenorrhea, you know, where there's like a lot of pain, a lot of like either clotting or cramping during the menstrual cycle. This is also really good for like polycystic ovary syndrome, fibroids, uterine fibroids, tumors, endometriosis, any kind of abdominal mass leading to blood stasis. This is a really phenomenal point for all of that. This is really good for when the limbs are kind of like cool or cold, and there's like a lot of blood stagnation in the extremities. So this is a really nice point for all of that. I also think about this in terms of like combining it with pericardium points for Raynaud's syndrome. So if I don't know if you know what Raynaud's syndrome is this is like an intense amount of like temperature variance in your hands and feet, often very cold, but it can also look very red. So the circulation to the far extremities has become impaired. And so when I think about this also in terms of the blood, you know, I think about this in terms of how it is classically indicated for the 9 heart pains. And so what that means is they're talking about stagnation of blood in the chest, right? Blood stasis in the chest. So this is a really good point for people who suffer from angina, high blood pressure, fullness in the chest, like constriction, you know, and again, I'm not talking about like an acute situation where there's like a heart attack. I mean, obviously you want to call 911 and get them to the ER. But I'm talking about people who are like kind of like chronically suffering from this at a sort of a low to moderate level, right? So this is really good for blood stasis in the upper jowl. So how you would feel that is maybe like a choppy pulse or a full pulse in the upper jowl pulses, and also on the tongue, you know, a fullness towards the tip, maybe even some redness, and it might be a little bit dry because of the like the damp heat congesting up there. So you know, when I think about people who have gotten kind of like the short end of the stick in life, who haven't really gotten a lot, they haven't really received a lot, they haven't gotten a lot of nourishment or care or thoughtful behavior, you know, thoughtful treatment. This is a really great point for somebody who feels kind of like mentally, spiritually barren. Like they've always gotten kind of like the short end of the stick. So this is a nice point for them to help remind them that, you know what, you don't have to live in the past anymore. Today's a new day, and you can live in a way that's harmonious for you, right? Think about this connection to the stomach. I can open and receive and be nourished by what I receive, that there is the possibility for that. And again, as a low point, this has a lot to do with, you know, people's sense of identity and emotions, right? So this is a really nice point to help remind people that, you know what, maybe not right in this moment, but eventually you will get what you need. And maybe it might take a little bit of effort on your part, again, because this is a yang point, right, it's connected to the stomach. You have to like go out and really look for things that are going to nourish you. They may not just fall into your lap. You know, you may actually have to like take some action. And that's like also the Changmai is about that. It's like activating your potential to fulfill your destiny. So this helps for people like it's never enough, or they've never had enough, or I'll never get enough. This is a really nice point for people like that. All right. Spleen 5, also a really interesting point. This point, it's a metal point. It is a sedation point when you sedate it. It's the Jing River point. Its actions are like fortifying the spleen, resolving dampness. So if you think about like the metal's relationship to the earth via the co-cycle, it helps like to move the chi along, right, to the metal. So like things that are stagnating from deficiency, like dampness results, phlegm results, insubstantial and substantial, that is things that you can see. Dampness you can see, phlegm you can see, and phlegm that you can't see, right? Phlegm you can see is substantial. Phlegm you can't is insubstantial, I believe. So this is like the preeminent point to do where there's any kind of like congestion, stagnation, mostly from heat. So this is a phenomenal point to combine with stomach 45 and stomach 43 for clearing the sinuses and clearing like heat and damp out of the head and the face. Phenomenal point for that. So it is, you know, connected to the lungs. It does impart the qualities of the lungs. So this is about purity and value. You know, the name itself, Shang Chu, merchant mound. Also, Shang refers to the note associated with the metal element in the 5 phases. And so, you know, if you think about this note, let's see, I had something to say about that and I just like blanked out. So I'll come back to I'm sorry. So I'm just reading one of the quotes here. Yeah, so as the metal point, and the sedation point. This is really good for any kind of excess condition involving the spleen. So again, heat rising up to the head, the dampness trapping that heat into the head, excessive dampness, which you can feel a slippery pulse, excessive dampness, which you see on the tongue as a coat, damp cold is white, damp heat is yellow or brown, right? So any type of and it might feel full on the pulse. So you put your fingers down and you might feel it like, wow, I feel this right as soon as I put my fingers on the skin, like that's an overflowing pulse. So that indicates an excess condition. This is a great point to sedate. Like I said, I often do it. We live in Maryland, which is just, where all allergies go to retire and die. So everybody comes in with some kind of sinus congestion at some point, allergies, rhinitis, sinusitis. This is a phenomenal point for draining that and opening the sinuses, clearing the heat, clearing the damp out of the head. Outstanding point. If you think about metal, what's a metal about? Purity, cleanliness. So it's like cleaning out, creating spaciousness, right? Because the lungs and the large intestines, they like the space, right? So this is a phenomenal point. Also, as a Jing River point, it's good. Jing River points are good technically for, especially on the yin, or for clearing out toxins, especially those affecting the voice. So damp heat affecting the throat, toxins affecting anywhere in the body, right? That can also lead to edema, right? Especially in the lower part of the body, the knees, the ankles, right? The feet. So this is a great point to purify, detoxify, cleanse on all levels of the body, mind, spirit. And so in that way, it kind of alleviates the burden that's being put on the spleen, because as the spleen and as the damp and phlegm accumulate, the spleen gets weaker and weaker. So also damp B affecting the joints and the sinews. This is said to benefit the sinews and the bones. And the reason why it does that, as the Jing River point, it has a powerful effect on the sinews. The sinews are what are called the yin within the yang, right? So anything more exterior than the internal organs is yang. The internal organs are the most yin within the yang, right? So that would be that's the deep internal, that's the yin. Anything external to that, the bones, would be the most yin of the yang. The sinews, right, are somewhat yin within the yang, right? So the Jing River points are said to have a powerful effect at clearing the damp and the heat that's obstructing the smooth flow of qi through the channels and collaterals, creating B obstruction syndrome, and that affects our ability to be flexible and to move. It also interferes with their abilities to be nourished by proper qi and blood circulation. So this is a really great point for people who've been, had some kind of pathogenic factor invasion, right? That's now gone into the level of the joints, the sinews, the tendons, and they get a lot of stiffness, they get a lot of pain, especially in damp, rainy weather. So this is a really great point for that on a physical level. And if you think about that on an emotional level, when the spleen becomes toxic and overloaded with damp and phlegm, it muddies the mind. We can't think clearly, and then we're prone to thinking a lot of negative thoughts. So metal is about our sense of value. So maybe you're sort of trapped. Again, damp is this flypaper. It traps pathogenic factors. It makes them sticky. Damp and phlegm is sticky, so it makes things stick. That's why it's hard to move phlegm and damp, because they're so easily stuck. So people might be really established in or very stuck obstinately in these negative stories about themselves or others in the world. And consequently, we then want comfort. So then we generally tend to eat and drink things that continue to pollute us, because we deeply believe, or the patient believes, that they're toxic or polluted, or they're not valuable or important in some way. So this is really good point for self-worth, or people who are really overly caught in perfectionism. So nice point for that. All right, so spleen 6. This is a 3 yin junction, 3 yin meeting, 3 yin intersection. this is said to be where the channels of the spleen, the kidney, and the liver all meet. So that's why it said in its indications, it harmonizes the spleen, the liver, and the kidney. So this is where like these meridians all converge, you know, for a short area around the area of spleen 6. Dedman puts it at 3 sun above the lateral medial malleolus. Worsley put it at 4, which is interesting because there's actually like this phenomenal master dung point found on the spleen channel at 4 sun that has a lot of similar functions as spleen 6 and is actually used often in combination with spleen 6. So this is the meeting point of the spleen, liver, kidney. So it's going to have a lot of multiple influences. And so this is like the most outstanding point for tonifying the spleen with spleen 3 and draining damp because of its relationship with the kidney and the liver regarding the fluids and the movement of things and the movement of fluids and chi through the body. If you think about like the spleen and the kidney, how they are both responsible for the creation of chi and the management of the fluids along with the lung. And then the liver, it provides the motivating force, right, to move and invigorate, right? So this is about moving dampness, moving accumulations, right? Helping to support our transitions when we feel stuck and we can't move, right? It's also said to be really good at invigorating the blood and draining damp. Again, like moving, getting these pathogenic factors to like move out, to be resolved, to get them out of the system, right? And therefore, that's why it's good at alleviating pain, because pain comes from stagnation. I look at this point as like dealing with like inappropriate ego-driven appetites that unbalance us and that divert our chi and blood, you know, away from where we feel nourished, where we're nourished the most. And so damp and phlegm then accumulate, and as a result of these habits, you know, related to excess eating, excess drinking, excess thinking, which like weaken, these all weaken the yang functions of the spleen and the stomach. So this is a really good point for like transformation. This is, I look at this point as like one of the most transforming of the spleen points. That's why it's nice to combine with spleen 3 to transform and transport, right? So this is really good at, on a physical level, any kind of irregular patterns involving like the period. So like irregular periods, scanty menstruation from chi and blood deficiency or stasis. This is really good for transforming the things that build up in the middle jiao, causing distension and pain. And if the spleen is overly weak and overly toxic with damp and phlegm, it affects our appetite. Our appetite is diminished. Cold or heat can kind of accumulate because, again, damp is like this flypaper. So you might affect damp and cold accumulations in the kidney and liver channel. So where that shows up the most is like in the lower jiao. You might get a lot of like genital itching from heat trapped in the lower jiao in the genital area, like hyper libido. For the kidney, you know, a lot of like cold can be affected or heat. So you get like either like these damp accumulations that inhibit urination, like urine retention, or you might get a lot of, and also like masses, like lower abdominal masses, or like weakened bladder and kidneys, right? Person gets to be very cold, right? As well as heat can affect these areas where you're getting a lot of agitation and heat, like urinary tract infections, excess urination, leakage, things like this. So this is really nice point to help people transform. Again, Earth is about transitions. It really helps them to transform their state, right? And these people will generally feel kind of stuck. They'll complain that they feel stuck. They complain that they feel heavy. They complain that they feel like kind of powerless. Again, think about the kidneys and liver. They're not able to like move forward in life. They're not able to like activate, even though they're thinking about all the things. Again, liver planning, kidney, you know, motivation, ambition. They've got a lot of like thoughts in their heads, but they just can't seem to like activate because they feel so like weighed down by obstructions and challenges and burdens, right? So this is a great point for people like that. I'm going to skip spleen 7. I don't really do that much except for really helping people to like who've like lost a lot of weight due to like atrophy and spleen chi deficiency, and then there might be a lot of like damp heat accumulations in the lower jiao or damp accumulations in the lower jiao. That's really what I kind of do, it is like to help nourish the person. Things are like leaking out, and it's called leaky valley. Spleen 8 I do very much more often. It's called Earth Pivot in Deadman, but we learned it by Worsley as Earth Motivator. And I think actually Earth Motivator, even though like, you know, Earth can be the pivot around which things move, right? You know, that which has the most mass, things revolve around that, right? So like our moon revolves around our Earth, but our Earth revolves around the sun because the sun has greater mass. But I think about, and so, you know, there's this quality of like movement and transition, even more than, or even in a slightly different way than spleen 6, right? Because spleen 6 is more about having the power to move and detoxifying what inhibits the movement, right? Movement forward, to transition things, to keep things from being stuck in one spot. Spleen 8 is about the type of movement that's more in relation to the chi cleft point. This is more about relatively more acute situations, things that come on suddenly. And I think this has more to do with like the blood than spleen 6. Spleen 6 definitely can help move blood stagnation, and you can even combine it with stomach 8 or spleen 8. But spleen 8 is like the chi cleft point. This is really good for like moving the blood, right? And there may not be like a whole lot of dampness. There could be some dampness, but there's more like blood deficiency, which is leading to blood stagnation, right? This is really great for patients who feel kind of like stubborn and inert from their attachment to what I call their not quite so comfortable comfort of with the familiar, right? So what's that phrase, like the devil you know beats the devil you don't? So these are people who are willing to continue either greatly or mildly self-destructive behavior patterns because it gives them on some level some sense of temporary comfort, but over time it's like kind of draining their chi, and then it has an effect on the blood. So you might show up as a full pulse, it might show up as a choppy pulse, it will definitely show up as a slippery pulse, but it like kind of keeps them stuck in the level of the body, mind, spirit that has a lot to do with like things that are happening like more suddenly, more recently, right? This is a good point. Like, so as a chi cleft point on the yin channels, these really have an additional effect on treating disorders of the blood. So yang chi cleft points probably deal more with like the chi and pathogenic factors. You know, the chi cleft points on the yin channels generally deal more with like blood stasis. So this is a really good point to combine with like CV4, sometimes CV3, but more CV4, maybe even some like lower kidney or stomach points to deal, especially like stomach 28 is phenomenal for people who experience a lot of like blood stasis in the uterus and the reproductive areas during menstrual cycle. So cramping, especially like severe cramping, a lot of clotting, dysmenorrhea, irregular menstruation, abdominal masses, fibroids and tumors, generally that are due to like blood stasis and maybe chi stagnation. This is such a phenomenal point. This is like the fibroid point, right? Especially when you combine it with like CV4 and you just mox the bejesus out of this point, right? This is so phenomenal at like fibroids and other accumulations in the lower jiao. So I often treat this with large intestine 4, especially with like kind of acute dysmenorrhea, acute pain, like, you know, the pain that doesn't like slowly build up over the course of like the week before, but it's like all of a sudden your period is here and it's like, right? You know, it's like you've got to have a water bottle, you got to go for like pain relievers. This is a great point to combine with large intestine 4 and sometimes liver 3, and really phenomenal to combine with electrostim on this point. and you would sedate it. And this really helps to like move a lot of chi and blood, especially through the lower jiao during the beginning part of the menstrual cycle where there's a lot of pain and cramping. Especially like when there's like a lot of fibroids involved. And of course, like fibroids are these big stagnant balls of, you know, blood and chi. And that obstructs the smooth flow of chi. And where there's obstruction, there's pain, right? So there's a text called The Investigation into Points Along the Channels. And it says, there is no disorder of the lower region, the lower jiao, that cannot be treated with spleen 8. And what they're talking about there is obstruction due to like blood stasis. So this is like the classic point. It said it's good for like resolving damp. Maybe a little, like it is earth motivator. So you think about like, you know, like if you've got like all this soil and you want to plant crops, you've got to go in there and you've got to till the soil. You've got to like work it. If you've got like plants like I do on our deck, right? You know, and they've been like sitting fallow, like under the deck for like, you know, the winter months, you got to go in there, you got to like break it up with your hands. I think about earth motivator like that. Let's go in there and let's get in there and let's break this stuff up. And that similarly equates with mental, emotional behavior patterns, right? And again, blood has a lot to do with our identity. So if you think about women and their menstrual cycle, like, you know, are they at ease with their identity? You know, I don't come across a lot of patients who are really at ease with their identity. Thankfully, some are. So I don't think it's necessarily like a gender issue, but I do treat, you know, a lot of women, and that seems to show up like when they are their authentic selves, they kind of get punished, or they punish themselves because they have these conditioned ideas about how they should be or shouldn't be, but I'm this way. And so that dissonance creates blood stasis. Yeah. Because we're taught, you know, as men, women, you know, or just like maybe you don't identify with a binary gender. Oh my God, right? So now, like both camps hate you. So you got it from both directions. It's not easy because I have a number of patients who don't identify as a particular gender. So, you know, how they personally identify might not be so like, it doesn't fit into like some simple little box. They don't check a simple box, you know, and we all are just a constellation of qualities and virtues. We, you know, just because you're, you know, identify as a man or a woman or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean this is all of who you are. So, you know, thankfully this is at least, you know, a country where you can somewhat be yourself, you know, but again, every place has its burdens. And so maybe the place where you were raised or the family you were raised, you know, didn't accept how you identified with yourself, and they sort of projected their identity onto you. And maybe you're someone that left an impact on. And so that's going to stagnate your blood. That's going to stagnate the smooth flow and powerful flow of your blood, right? You look at people who grew up in families where there's a great deal of acceptance and love for whoever the hell you were and whatever the hell you wanted to pursue, right? And, you know, they have less blood stagnation issues. Now, I'm not saying all blood stagnation issues are from this. It could be from your diet. It could be like, you know, you swam a lot as a kid and that, you know, invaded your lower jiao, and, you know, now you've got painful periods because you were swimming in a cold pool a lot, you know, early in the morning because you were training, or a gymnast or whatever. So I'm not saying just that, but that's something at least to like keep in mind, right? How, you know, what's this earth, because, you know, we're earth, right? We're more earth than spirit or than sky, right? So, you know, how do you relate to this thing, your body? How do you relate to your form, your flesh, your earthly existence? You know, what's your relationship to your identity? And does that create a smooth flow and expansiveness and warmth and power, or does it create something else? Okay. All right. So that brings us to spleen 9. One of the best points to deal with dampness. It's a water point. It's a He point, right? So, you know, water points deal with like fluid issues. Imparts the influence of the kidney here because the spleen is a zong, kidneys is a zong. So it's a He point. So you're dealing with the depths. You're dealing with what we deal with deep inside. You know, Deadman talks about it as regulating the spleen and resolving dampness. It opens and moves the water passages, right? So with the power of the kidney, and it's close to liver 8, so that's sort of in the neighborhood, right? So it helps to move the fluids through their water passages. So this is a phenomenal point for when water is not moving to its water passages. And what that looks like is edema. Anywhere in the body, particularly the lower jowl, and when I say lower jowl, I'm also including the hips and legs, because again, water seeks its own level, and it's generally going to sink because it's heavier, right? So this is predominantly good for edema in the lower body. Like over the course of the day, maybe, you notice your ankles swell because the circulation of the fluids is impaired, then spleen 9 is your point, right? Moxa it, moxa it, moxa it, moxa it. If somebody has exuberant heat, they're probably not going to have a lot of edema unless the heat is scorching the fluids and damp accumulates in that regard. But unless somebody has like an exuberant heat signs, rapid pulse, red face, red tongue, dry tongue, maybe like a dark coat, and is hot, like, okay, yeah, then don't moxa them. Or maybe just moxa a little bit in the local area that might feel cold, right? Because again, where there's heat one place, there's often cold in another. So this is like really an awesome point for excess fluid accumulations, edema in the legs, edema in the abdomen, sluggish, slow digestion, diarrhea, soggy spirit, soggy mind. They're like, they're kind of like Eeyore. I don't know if we can do it, right? Like everything's a burden, because they're already burdened internally with all this like damp and phlegm and fluid accumulation, right? And John Pirog, in the practical application of meridian style acupuncture, it was a Japanese style book, he said spleen 9 is kind of an acupunctural diuretic. And I remember this one dude came to see me. He had like weak kidneys, and so we tonified the bejesus out of his kidneys. He's like, he's walking damp, right? I mean, he's very spherical. And very well upholstered, like, just drank beer, ate chicken wings. I mean, the guy was like a poster for spleen damp, kidney fluid accumulation. And so I would do these treatments on him, and he would literally be like I couldn't retain the needles for very long. He's like, oh, I gotta go. And he would go, and he would just like pee. Like, he was like, I don't know, like I come in here and it's like I feel like I pee my body weight. Like he's in there for like 5 minutes peeing, So this is a phenomenal point. Like, but you have to be prepared for like people you're gonna be like doing this point on for like a lot of fluid accumulation, and you're gonna like use it as a diuretic. Like you have to stay on top of them. Like I have a little wireless doorbell chime that they hold. So like, sure enough, if I'm doing this point on people, like I have to really keep an eye out, because I have to run in there, take needles out so they can go pee. And that's a good sign. That means transformation is happening, right? So this is a really great point, especially for like edema around the knee, when the cartilage is very dry or damaged, like the body tries to protect us by accumulating fluid around the area. So this is also good for like clearing some of the heat out of the local area, bringing moisture and fluid to the area, but also clearing a lot of the dampness out of the local area as well as the body. Similarly, on a deficient side, if a person's extremely dry and there's a lot of hardness, a lot of bitterness, a lot of dryness on the body, mind, spirit, there's no juiciness, there's no flexibility, there's no capacity for introspection and thoughtfulness about like the deeper nature of things. And really looking at like, okay, you feel burdened, like, okay, what's underneath of that? What's that about for you? Maybe a lot of weird fears, a lot of weird phobias. Again, I think about my friend Lillian, who, was like terrified of leaving the house and like all these obsessive stuck thoughts. Like, I'm sure this would have been a phenomenal point for her. So I do this a lot of like, on people who are like, very obsessive, right? And so how I would recommend the body posture, I think that's, how do you recommend positioning for administering moxa on this point? Well, you could have them just lying down on their back with their leg kind of like abducted, right? So that, you kind of like like twist or bend their leg this way, right? You know, you just sort of like move their leg this way a little bit, so, and like bring their foot a little bit up. So it's not quite a figure four, but maybe, you know, the bottom of their foot is touching maybe the inside of their calf at some point, maybe around spleen 6, spleen 8, you know, and that's an easy way to get to it. Or if they're more flexible, they can bend a little more. I don't want them to bend too much, but that's an easy way. Or you just use a lot of chapstick. Or just, you know, roll the leg just just tilt the knee just a little bit outward if that's comfortable, and just bend it just a little bit, and you can get right up in there. Little chapstick, moxa sticks, no problem. Yeah, so this is a really good point for also people who are like they're driven by their thoughts, and like their excessive activity has kind of like wiped them out and like exhausted their yin. So this is a nice point to impart a sense of more thoughtful introspection and a little more like slower moving through life, you know, a little bit more easy goingness to life, a little bit more like kind of go with the flow, more of the yin qualities of the water, which is about cooling, refreshing, soothing. You know, an overly driven, overly ambitious person, it's like burning up their yin, burning up their fluids, you know, and their thoughts, they're really driven by their thoughts, right? Again, it's not about like accomplishing or reward. It's like, maybe it's about service. People are like addicted to service, and they run themselves ragged. You know, I knew someone like this at the Maryland Food Bank. You know, she like basically just like wore herself down to the point where she got seriously physically ill. You know, she was extremely yin deficient because she just wanted to give and give and give and give and give. Also motivated primarily by guilt. And so like she wanted to give back, and just like, you know, she gave and served until she like wore herself out. This would be a really nice point to moxa, to stimulate, to, you know, replenish. Say, you know what, like you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be like so overly motivated. Like we can move more slowly, more introspective. You know, you can kind of connect to your depths and also connect to your inner power, right? So water has a lot to do with inner power, especially spleen, kidney. You know, the fluids are what give us power in life. So this is a really nice point for people who feel powerless to make transitions in their lives, powerless to receive, powerless to, you know, resolve their burdensome thoughts. Like you have the capacity to take care of this spacesuit. You know, you do have the power to care for yourself and others. So this really helps to empower that aspect of courage and wisdom to persevere through life. You know, Earth CFs are very, they feel, one of the themes that shows up in a lot of the people I treat in Earth is like this sense of like almost everything is a burden. You know, it's like it requires, because they always think, because they go into their head so much, they think about all the things that like need to be done, like all at one moment. Like, you know, I think about someone that I know, like, well, okay, maybe we should change the curtains. Well, in order to do that, you know, we have to like change the curtain rods, and we have to put in new windows, and we have to paint because, you know, we have to, like, if we're going to do a new color scheme, we have to like paint the entire bedroom. And then that means, you know, we're gonna have to like change the carpeting and rearrange the artwork. And I'm like, maybe just the curtains. You know, like, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, you patient, like maybe don't need to take on this massive thing like Atlas. You know, maybe you could just get some different curtains. You know what I mean? Like, so there's this quality that like they get like so caught up in their head, and then everything becomes this like giant burden. One of my patients is like that. She's really, really, really funny in that way. All right. Let's just power through like a couple more points, and then we'll finish at 11:45. Spleen 10. Awesome point. This one person I knew, she said, she was a colleague of mine, she said, spleen 10 is the reason why I went to acupuncture school. She had awful periods, painful periods, and she went to this person. I think the guy, he's a really interesting character. His name is Live Good. I don't know if he's still around, but he was trained by Worsley back in the 70s. And so if you palpate, and I actually want all of you to palpate this point, actually palpate spleen 9 and palpate spleen 10. And if spleen 9 and spleen 10 are not painful for you or uncomfortable, I want you to say so in the chat box. So palpate spleen 9, like really palpate it. Palpate spleen 10, Tusun, above in the line of the spleen, like right in that muscle, right? And for those of you where one of those points is not tender, say so in the chat room. These 2 points are tender on pretty much every single female I have ever treated. And especially on people that have like uncomfortable periods. This is like one of the most phenomenal blood invigorating, blood moving, and therefore blood cooling points on the body. Now, I used to think, based on something that I thought I heard Worsley say, that this was a good blood building point. I've actually not found this to be a good blood building point, but it is good for when spleen 10, no discomfort. Spleen 9, very painful, spleen 10, nothing. Okay, so for those of you where there's like not a lot of discomfort in spleen 10, do you have, 1, do you still have period? And 2, like, is the period like really crampy? Is it painful?
I haven't had my period in months.
Okay, so I would say it's probably not very painful then.
Not at all.
So when you did have periods, was it painful?
Yes.
Okay.
I would have like, I'd say 2 or 3 days of it were pretty painful.
Yeah, I'll bet you back then spleen 10 would have been pretty painful.
Yeah.
Pretty sore. So this is like, these 2 points are like really good diagnostic points. Spleen nothing. Okay, good for you, Medea. Nice. Yeah, so, and again, not always, but most of the time, people who have painful periods, spleen 9 and spleen 10 are going to be pretty sore. This is a really good point for any kind of menstrual disorder of any type involving the circulation, mental agitation. Again, blood has a lot to do with our mood, our state of mind, our identity, right? Also, it's very nourishing and energizing. So like people feel a lot of fatigue, maybe just before, maybe even like the blood is so deficient that you're seeing a lot of floaters, or you get like blurry vision before your periods or just after the flow. But this is a phenomenal blood mover, blood invigorator. So when you hear invigorating, you hear moving. And anytime you hear moving, you'll hear cooling, right? So if something is moving, it's not going to be stagnant, because stagnant turns into heat, right? Even cold that's stagnant for a long period of time will turn into heat because of the friction of that obstruction. So this is a phenomenal point for when the spleen, liver, or kidneys are suffering from some chronic Qi deficiency that eventually stagnates and makes deficient the blood, right? So cold can stagnate the blood, damp heat can stagnate the blood, but this point is such a phenomenal blood mover, which is good for any kind of blood level issue, which can include menstrual disorders as well as skin disorders like eczema, rosacea, acne, where there's a lot of blood heat and blood toxins stagnating the blood, right? So this is a phenomenal point. I cannot tell you how many women have said, oh my God, like it never occurred to me that I could actually experience like ease during my period. Like it just never, like I thought this would never be possible. And spleen 10 to the rescue, spleen 9 to some degree, spleen 8, spleen 6 and 3, these are phenomenal points. Liver 5, liver 6, liver 8. These are all great points to like help invigorate and move the blood, which then cools the blood. And so this is also good to some degree, like people experience some kind of traumatic injury where there's some kind of bruising or inflammation of a muscle or a joint that's creating a lot of stagnation, fluid and blood stagnation. Also bruising obviously is a giant, sign of blood stagnation. So these are really great points to incorporate for bruising or traumatic injury, impact injury anywhere on the body. You'll often see this as a purple colored tongue and a choppy pulse. Not always, but usually if you're feeling it closely enough. And like fixed pains, like, like sharp fixed pains, that's often blood, right? But, or like intense cramps, like fixed in a spot, like that, like, oh, you like want to double over, and like heating pads are like good, or hot water bottles are good. Spleen 10 is your go-to. Really great point. And so I think about that as like, you know, things that are like agitating the mind, where people feel really stuck in who they are, stuck in their job, stuck in their school, stuck in a rut, right? This is a really great point to invigorate and move the blood which houses the Shen to invigorate their Shen. So it's a nice point to include with spleen, bladder 20, the AEP of the spleen, bladder 18, AEP of the liver, maybe even bladder 23 if they're feeling a lot of like stuck from powerlessness, right? And maybe the outer bladder line points for these different officials as well. Nice combination. Also with bladder 38, which is very blood invigorating and blood building and blood nourishing. You can also combine it with bladder 17, the influential point of blood, which is more blood moving as well. So when there's a lot of blood stasis in the body, maybe somebody's been through traumatic physical injury or some kind of psychological traumatic shock, where their minds have become very stuck in this past shocking traumatic event, and it's hard to move on into the future and see who they are now and see who they could be in the future, right? So I've gone 3 minutes over, so I apologize, but I wanted to include spleen 10. So be on the lookout. I will upload a, for some reason, Canvas has been really tough to upload on Canvas, the recordings. So I'll just do it to my YouTube channel. But, you know, so look for it there, and I'll also upload the next discussion board discussion.
I have it in my notes that